I'm a little uncomfortable. I got my wing back a little bit today, and doctor said that I'm good enough to hold a cup of coffee and nothing more, which is nice for getting out of the housework and things around the house a little bit, but I don't know how the coffee only thing is going to work for me, so we'll see. But happy to be able to be back here with you all and dive a little deeper into our study. So picking up a little bit, we're going to try to do some cruising today. I know Joe kind of got into chapters 10 and 11 last time he was here. I'm going to try to go skim from chapter 10 to chapter 16. So that doesn't mean that we don't stop and have discussion, but I'm not going to read all of every verse as we go, but kind of want to just talk through some of I'll call them the highlights. For me, like I said, this study is an interesting one, and it's for a couple of reasons. One is, I think Joe termed it, it's kind of like the Twitter of the Bible, right? So it's sometimes one-line words of wisdom, things that sometimes we probably already know and need to be reminded of once in a while. But there's some humor in there too. We'll talk a little bit about some things today that I think I find interesting. So remember this section, 10 through 16 in Proverbs, is referred to as the Proverbs of Solomon. So this is kind of going back a little bit. This is where Solomon is giving this advice based on his experience, based on God's wisdom that he gave to him. So for 10, the picture that I see is that Proverbs as a whole is designed to basically teach us about God's design of the world and how that we're supposed to work under his governing authority. I mean, that's the context for me. And the reoccurring theme that we've been talking about is kind of the two paths, right? The path of wisdom and the wise. The wise seek to understand and live within God's path. And on the contrast, the fool or people that are foolish, they ignore that. They ignore God's plan and sometimes even shun what his teachings are. So it's kind of a left or a right. Proverbs 10 through 16 is going to continue in that. There's a whole bunch of what I call the one-line comparisons within 10 through 16, which for me are good because they're, number one, repetitive in nature. So you'll see as you go through here common themes, and we are people that need to be reminded, at least I are, need to be reminded of kind of, you know what, I know it says that somewhere, and then we can look in Scripture and find it in multiple places. So it gives us examples, and I'll call it practical, applicable things that we can do in the way that we live. And the theme of living in the fear of God, in the fear of the Lord. That's it. Or if you remember, we talked about that term and what that kind of really is talking about is following him, living, putting him in the place that he belongs as king, as first in everything that we do. And sometimes we live in a world that teaches us to look out for number one, which we should be. It just disagrees on who that number one is sometimes. And I think this book in particular reminds us always to focus on the fact that he is number one, and we need to be always focused on him. Some of the things that we deal with in life distract us, right? And we have to figure out our path, and figure out our path not by what we feel is right or what we think, but by what he tells us is right. And we know that this is his map, right? His directions for us. So we'll get into kind of the overview. Again, I'm not going to read through all of the stuff, but I'm going to share a lot of snippets as we go, and we can pause and talk about some of the detail as we go. So when I was looking through this section, trying to make notes on, hey, I want to cover this, I want to cover that, and I'm a little bit particular when it comes to keeping notes, right? Taking notes, and mainly because I'm forgetful, so I need to have things, and I'm a color guy, so if you ever catch my notes, you'll see colors, highlighters, red, all these different colors, and mainly it's just because my eyesight's not that good and I need something to focus me back in. But when I was going through this, and I started with a notebook, to be honest, and writing what I wanted to talk through today. And what I ended up doing is going back and creating kind of a table. And the table for me is, because there's so many scriptures within 10 through 16 that are similar in what it says and how it overlaps, that I thought it was easier to categorize it the way my mind works, and I could say, okay, here's the scriptures that talk to, the verses that talk to that. So Joe started a couple weeks ago in chapter 10, where he talked about a wise son bringing joy to his father and a foolish son grief to his mother, and we talked a little bit about that. That same theme occurs in chapter 13, verse 1, 15:5, and 15:20. That same theme about a wise son bringing is something that a parent can be proud of. I mean, in my way of saying it. And I think that, again, seems logical, seems simple for us to understand, but I also think there's a reason that he's telling this, and it reoccurs. As we look at the characteristics that are outlined of the righteous or the wise, sometimes in Proverbs that is used interchangeably. There are things that we learn, and one of them that I think is a key theme is humility. Now, being humble, what does it mean to be humble? Nobody here is humble. What does it mean to be humble?
Too humble to say.
Yeah, thanks, I appreciate it. Don says he's too humble to tell us.
To recognize your weakness.
To recognize your weakness. So it's interesting to me, and I think Christ was the ultimate example. He was man in the flesh, deserved to be treated as a king, but he came in a lowly form as a man. I don't know how you can have an extreme example of humility beyond that, to be honest. I've worked with a lot of people that really have not mastered this trait. And I said, we live in a world where the world teaches you to, put yourself first and to make sure, I'm paraphrasing life here, but to make sure that people know what you do and what you're capable of, right? Like, and guys, I'm going to be chauvinistic here. If a guy goes up to introduce himself, 9 times out of 10, it's, hey, what do you do for a living, right? And people, and maybe generations change, but people take, I'll say, pride in what they do, and it becomes an identity for them, doesn't it? And one thing that I appreciate is I had some examples in my life, both work and at home, where I really felt like I had an example of humility, and I learned from that. And it's much better to have somebody else brag about what you do than for you to brag about what you do. And my dad was that for me. I mean, I would never catch him being boastful. Just wasn't who he was, who he is. I will say one story. We used to go on canoe trips, family canoe trips when we were in Arkansas, and we'd spend up to a week going down the river, and we were all fishing in the canoes. It really was a fishing, not catching trip. I'll say it that way. But it was fun. But my dad would have fun because he sat there and he'd set the hook and he goes, oh, I got one. Oh, I got off. Oh, I got one. Oh, I got off. And we're catching fish left and right. And every time he's like, oh, it's got off. Well, he went like the whole morning and didn't catch a fish. And like everybody else that was there was catching fish. And we were teasing him, and he's like, yeah, whatever, We stopped for lunch, and we pulled off, and my brother, I'm pretty sure he has this on a video camera, but my brother was taking a look while Dad was building a fire or whatever for lunch, and he's looking at the canoes, and he goes up to my dad's fishing rod, and he sees that his fishing lure had a spinner lure. There was no hook on it. So he said, hey, Dad, do you think maybe this is why you're not catching any fish? And he goes, well, anybody can catch them with a hook. That to me that's who he is, right? He just rolled with it. He didn't get upset by it, but he just had fun with it. And I actually wrote a college paper about that story, actually. But yeah, it's things like that you see in life and examples that help kind of shape you, right? We have some very good examples in Scripture that teach us how to act. About being humble, if you go to chapter 11 in Proverbs, verse 2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. So the opposite of humility is what? Pride. What do you think of when you think of pride? Don't say the Detroit Lions because I'm still sensitive. No, pride, it to me resonates a sense of arrogance, boastfulness. Now, is it wrong to be proud of something? Right? I mean, it says that a wise son makes his father glad or could be proud, right? It's not wrong to be proud of something, but when that becomes a character trait for you, that your pride is there. There's a number of verses, and if you want to write them down, we'll cover through some of them, but I jotted down a few. Chapter 11, verse 2, chapter 15, verse 25 talks to it. 15:33 talks to it. 16:5 talks to it, and 16:18 all talk to this concept of humility is better than pride and arrogance. And going a little bit further, you find, I'll call it, in my way of thinking anyways, there's a logical cadence to it, right? I came into a company in a transition, and it was like in the business side of my career. It's been interesting for me, and what I mean is, when I started in the business that I'm in, I worked in an environment that I was made to believe that the people that knew more had an office, and they were, if you were wrong, they ruled with an iron fist. Maybe you've heard that term, right? You pound the desk, therefore you're letting them know you're in charge, right? And that was kind of an era, I would say. And I struggled with that, and mainly because I don't respond well to that type of thing. And I had the good fortune of having some mentors in my path that taught me that you really don't have to do that to gain respect. But when you go to a new company and that's the culture that was there, it takes a lot to kind of overcome that. And it's not just going in and making a change. And I'm not going to tell you that one way is superior to the other way. I think there's a time and a place where you have to have a sense to stand up and do things. But what I've found is you can get a lot more accomplished if the people that you're trying to lead get what you're trying to accomplish and they understand it. And it's not just a because I said so. How many here are parents? How many here are guilty of because I said so? I am. And mainly because I've decided we don't negotiate with terrorists. But in the end, you end up figuring out how to get from point A to point B, how to solve it. Now, we're going to get to it because I think it's an interesting topic, but we're going to get to the scripture where we're going to talk about sparing the rod and spoiling the child. Every parent's favorite subject, right? But the idea, I think, is common with this as well, is I can tell you we didn't do everything right as parents. My kids will tell you, say the same thing, maybe different words, but they're going to tell you we didn't do everything right. But every day, we didn't forget that those kids were a gift from God. And there's days where I wanted to figure out how to return gifts. I mean, you can't always do that. But I will tell you, to this day, I feel that way. And the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I won't tell you which one is which, by the way. But you realize that the wisdom that is being taught in the book of Proverbs is awesome wisdom for every stage in our life. For me personally, I could have used a lot of that earlier in my parenting days. And just to help me understand that I'm not the only one that struggles, right? And I don't know if you guys have ever struggled or not, but I can tell you, we went through some stuff. And I'll say, lean on the scriptures where it talks about when your kids bring you honor, basically, is my paraphrase, right? When they show wisdom, it makes you feel really good as a parent, right? And you'd love to take all the credit for that. But the reality is there's a divine lesson there. And so for me, as we go into this, even the humility side of this and the prideful side, that was a little bit of also a challenge. Learning. There's no instruction manual when you have kids, except for this one. You buy anything from the store and you leave with a pamphlet. Now I think you get a QR code and you can watch a video on how to do it, right? And if you can't figure it out, then you ask your kids. But there are instructions on what to do. When we're going into things, there was a time, again, many moons ago when we became parents, I had this feeling like, well, we're supposed to know how to do this. We're the parents. And we quickly learned to rely on each other and go, I don't know what to do here. What do you think we should do? And so you figure it out. But some of it is trial and error. Some of it is prayer. Some of it is going through studies like this one, where you can see that we're not the only ones going through this. The pride and arrogance thing is an interesting discussion for me, an interesting topic. Because, again, the world kind of teaches us differently than the Bible teaches us. It teaches a humility in spirit and kind of drives us to behave differently. And I think that's by design. I think we had the perfect example of that in Christ. But you see the human nature is to defend our position. Right? Anybody but me guilty of that? Like, I'll go into a meeting sometimes and my most important point in the meeting is to make sure everybody understands that I'm right. I don't usually walk away with that accomplishment, but some of it is about having confidence. And I think in the world, we confuse confidence with pride. And I don't think it's the same. But I think it's a difficult lesson for people to learn that, you know what, like sometimes you have to smile and go, yep, I've been fishing without a hook on the end of my line, and just laugh it off. I mean, that's how it goes. And you learn from things, and you do. But he did change his lure, by the way, after lunch and caught a few fish. But what about this one? This is an interesting one. Let's turn to chapter 12, verse 1. So somebody want to read that for me? 12, verse 1.
Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid.
I love that one. So who in here loves discipline? Let me change that. Who loves to give out discipline? Do you think that's what 12 is talking about? Those that are giving out discipline? I don't think so. I think it's talking about people that love to be corrected. What does it mean? Like I can tell you this: I don't like being disciplined in a general sense.
I think none of us do, but we have to learn how to take it and use it.
Yeah. What if you weren't disciplined? Let's have that discussion.
Then you better go find someone that can help you get yourself disciplined.
So I think it's interesting because when I was a kid, I had a lot of, my parents weren't, I'll say crazy strict, but they were strict, right? I grew up in a house where I had rules, I had curfew, there was expectations for me, right? And I had friends that didn't have that. I had friends that came as they pleased, and do you think I liked that as a kid? Well, what about them? They don't have a curfew. What am I, in prison? I can tell you this. A lot of times at the time when you're being disciplined, right? You don't necessarily appreciate it the way that you do later.
Yes. I for example, my parents would always say this would hurt me. It's going to hurt us more than it hurts you. But when you're young, you're like, what? But then when you get older, you go, oh, what they really meant is, I don't want to have to do this, but I have to do this because I love it.
I think I may have shared it in a class before about, since Mike's in here, I'll pick on him. When Mike was probably maybe 2, he was the most stubborn child on the face of this earth. It might have changed since then, but he was stubborn. And April, for any of you that don't know, she likes to decorate. And she's really good at it. And she has stuff everywhere, everything in the house is just so, and knickknacks galore. She was determined, I'm not going to put everything up on a high shelf. I'm going to teach the kids to leave things where they are. It's a great idea. It stinks to implement, but it's a great idea. And I can remember vividly, Mike grabbed some knickknack. I couldn't tell you what the knickknack was. It was probably $2. But he grabbed it, and April started with the no, firm, no. Took it out of his hand and sat down. He looked at her and grabbed it again. And she said, I said no. Literally like that. And set it down, and he got a look on his face, grabbed it again. And she said, by the time this ended, I'll just go, by the time this ended, they were both crying. Mike's hand was red, but he stopped picking it up. At the time, I don't think he really appreciated getting disciplined. At the same time, I can tell you for certainty, April hated it. I really believe that that is a microcosm of what God feels. I really do. I see that example that's very practical for me. But when you see things happen in the world that we live in, I don't know if you guys are aware, but it's not a perfect place that we live. And there's a lot of things that are wrong. There's a lot of good, too. And I don't know, I wonder, I think differently as a parent than I did before I had kids.
When I was 18 years old, I was disciplined by a man that was in the military. He just got rid of the basic training. And then I didn't realize at the time that he was really disciplined. I was a wise guy. I was fighting every day with somebody because of these little things I want to fight. And I blame that because I came out of the hills of Kentucky where it was a survival of the fittest.
Every man for himself.
Or you was going to get beat up.
Yeah.
So anyway, I still remember exactly where I was sitting. I was on at the barracks. I was sitting on the outside of the steps, taking a chain, shining my boots, okay? This guy walked up to me, and I'd probably seen him, but I didn't know who he was. And I was only in there about just no more than 3 or 4 days. And this guy came up to me, and I'd already been in fights. This guy came up to me, Ernie DeRosa was his name, from Tacoma, Washington. He was drafted in the service. He looked at me and he said, you know, you're nothing but a wise guy. And he stood about 5'7" and could throw a football the full length of the field, you know. So he said, you're nothing but a wise guy. He said, you got a chip on your shoulder, and he says, and I'm going to remove it. That's what he said.
I'm glad he did,
He said,
Baxter.
you don't change your ways, your actions, whatever. He said, I'm going to take that chip off your shoulder, and I can do it. And you know what? That changed my whole outlook of my basic training. I don't think I mean, I've never had anybody, I mean, that was, to me, was discipline.
Yeah.
He actually straightened out my attitude.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and the thing of it is parents go through the same thing, right? In different ways. I can tell you, and kind of jumping ahead to a scripture coming, but talking about disciplining your kids. And there's a whole psychology, right, around what's the right way, what's the wrong way. And I won't go into all the detail, but I was raised in a house that I will tell you, we all knew what a spanking was, and we all wanted to avoid them. We weren't afraid of our parents. It wasn't like that. But there was I think he called it a healthy respect. And it's funny because I have friends that have taken a different route, and they want to have, they want to negotiate with their kids. Like I said, I don't negotiate with terrorists, so for me, it didn't work that way. but they said, oh, well, we're gonna do timeouts, and the joke is, well, sometimes they need a knockout. They don't really need a knockout. I'm not saying it that way, but the point is, I think there's extreme directions you can take, right? And again, the only instruction manual that really exists is this one, right? It's God's word, and understanding what's behind the actions should shape the actions, in my way of thinking. If you look at the things that Proverbs, and this is just the section that I'm talking about between chapters 10 and 16, some of the character traits of the wise, right, or the righteous that are called out. I talked about humility already. Loving discipline. We talked about that. We voted on who loves discipline. Listens to advice. That's a character trait, right? To be able to listen to advice. But what if you're in charge? You're supposed to be giving direction. Are we still supposed to listen to advice in that role? I think it's pretty plain. that we are. Chapter 12, verse 15 says, "The way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice." What does it mean, the way of a fool seems right to him? What do you think that means?
I'd say it's kind of prideful, and he already knows everything,
Maybe he thinks he knows, right? Doesn't need advice.
but he does, because without that advice, to realize what's right and doing the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's kind of interesting the way it's worded to me. The way of a fool seems right to him. That means they're too dumb to realize they're wrong, right? Oh wait, as you, well, I've had neighbors before that were the nicest people that you'd ever meet. We tried and tried to get them to go to church with us. You know, their grandkids were our kids' age. So we got to know them because the kids played together and stuff like that. And I can't tell you how many times we had the conversation, and the answer was, well, honey, we're living a good life, and we just think we're doing everything we need to do. And it's hard because you don't want to thump them on the head with the word,
Right.
but you want to have, I do think they were really good people, and it kind of is, it hurts to think that they're misguided, right? Because I think we're told pretty clearly in Scripture that there's going to be a lot of good people that don't make it because they didn't follow the path. And so I'm not calling them fool. Don't misunderstand me, but I think sometimes when you're not on the right path, you don't realize that you're not on the right path. And maybe you run into that drill sergeant that disciplines you and wakes you up to see where the yellow and white lines are so you get back on the road, right? Maybe that's what we need. I know I need it from time to time. Bill?
Great example. Have you ever put the wrong address in your GPS?
I have. Hey, wait, is this confession time?
I did that just recently, right?
Yeah.
And it's not until you get to a point where you thought you should be turning and you're not, that you realize, I must have done something wrong. But before that, the way of a fool seems right in his own eyes. You know, and it's something that you can absolutely 100% identify with.
Uh-huh.
When you're following the green line, it's like, well, I'm going the exact right way. And then all of a sudden, that exit goes by, and you're like, it still says go north. I know I went that way every other time.
Yep.
It's a feeling in the pit of your stomach that you get that can't be truly identified. You know, you can't identify, but every single person who's had that opportunity to realize it can remember what it feels like, right? And it's an interesting thought to think about how many people in the world are following the green line, but they've just put the wrong address.
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy. It is. Bill?
The other analogy is relying on your own knowledge and knowing you have the right address in, but it's telling you to continue straight, but you can get off on that exit, and then you wind up in a 4-hour traffic backup.
So what you're saying is,
you have to be discerning and follow the word.
so I have a confession to make. My GPS, I changed to an Australian male voice on my GPS.
Wonder how that goes.
And when I was asked, why did I do that? And I said, because when April's with me, I don't need two women telling me I'm going the wrong way. I'm going to pay for that one later, but I couldn't remember. No, I mean, it is true. And I think we've probably all done that as well, where we like, no, that can't be right. And the thing I hate the most on technology today is that little circle that says, what, recalculating?
Yeah.
I need that on my forehead sometimes when I get hit between the eyes on something. So while we're in chapter 12, let's look at verse 16. A fool shows his annoyance at once, but a prudent man overlooks an insult. What do you think that's talking about? Forgiveness, yeah. I think so. I think this goes back to a little bit of, in my mind, the patient thing. And I think it's interesting. A prudent man overlooks an insult. So when somebody does something that bothers you, you don't have to correct them on the spot. Now, I think I probably have shared this with you before. I am anti-social media. I'm not on social media. But what I do know about it is apparently that filter doesn't exist in today's world. And people find it a requirement to let you know that they're right and you're wrong on a regular basis. I mean, I'm outside looking in. These are things I'm hearing. But I think this is an example of sometimes keeping your mouth shut a little bit longer is a sign of wisdom, but it also keeps the obvious picture of you being foolish by blurting out the first thing that pops in your head. And that's a tough one to take sometimes, because if you know that you're right, you want people to know you're right, right? But it kind of goes back to what I said about being humble, I think, as well, because how much better is it for somebody else to correct the situation, and it turns out you were right, but somebody else pointed it out instead of you. I think it's a lot more impactful. So these are just pieces that are very interesting for me, shaping for me, and I hope they are to you as well. Here's one I kind of highlighted here as well, just some snippets that I thought that caught my eye as I'm going through this study. Chapter 12 again, verse 4. The wife of a noble character is her husband's crown. What is that talking about? So I need to have a trophy wife, right? That's what that means. I don't think so. I think it's pointing to the decisions that we make in our life are reflected in who we are with, I believe, and who we are around.
When we make the right decision.
When we make the right decisions. Does that mean we make all good decisions?
No, not always.
I'm glad that you admitted to it finally, Curtis.
I'm not perfect, and I know that. I'll be the first one to say that.
I'm far from it.
Yep.
But I think when we talk about it, and we'll get to it when we get to the end of Proverbs, where it really talks about this wife of noble character, right? And it can refer to a physical spouse, but it also is the idea of the decisions that we're making to follow the right path is better than anything else. And we can be, if there's anything that we can boast on, it should be in Jesus Christ. Full stop.
The thing is, when we do it right, and according to His way, we're happier.
Are we always happy because we're there?
Not always, but we have to work at it.
I'm convinced, and there's scriptures here that talk about the benefit of living this way is healthy for us. I think you got to talking and didn't get too far, but
That's okay. We'll
you're gonna let me off the hook for flying a little bit. So I want to touch on a couple of thoughts, and I'll say you guys spend some time this week, if you would, kind of looking through, particularly chapter 16, I think is interesting. What I want to say is, as we go through this, there's a lot of these one-line comparisons that really can help us to give us something to attain, to go for, right? To think about the differences, right, between being humble and being proud, and how to use that in our lives. There's a lot of, I'll call them individual betterments, right, for lack of a better way to say that. I find it interesting, though, there's a few verses that talk about that chapter 11, verse 11, it says, by the blessings of the upright, a city is exalted. 11:14 says, for lack of guidance, a nation falls, but many advisors make victory sure. 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. My point of kind of pointing those scriptures out is this path that we're on is intended to be a personal journey. Every one of us is going to answer for ourselves, okay? The scriptures are clear about that. Does that mean that we ignore the impact we have on others? Like I said, if we're looking out for number one, like the world teaches, we would say that, right? But if we're really looking out for the real number one, then it's our own issue we have to address first. But we have to be mindful that our actions, our character matters. I think the church is a great example of how we live in a community that makes a difference. Are we perfect? No. Far from it, right? Except Curtis. But everybody else is far from it. But the point is, we have a lot that is on our plate that we need to be responsible for. And we need to remember that we're on this journey and we want to help people find their way. We want to be their GPS, for lack of a nice way to say it, and get them on the path. So then we can commiserate about all the mistakes we made in the past together, but celebrate that we're past that, right? Every day is a challenge, and everything we do reminds us that we're imperfect. I don't know, I don't like to turn the news on because it drives me nuts, frankly. Rarely do you see a feel-good story. There's occasionally. But we have a whole feel-good story here if we take the time to dig into it and find that. Last point, because I'm out of time, but the last point, this is really important for me personally. Turn to chapter 16 and verse 31. I use this one when my kids harass me all the time. It says, gray hair is a crown of splendor. It is attained by a righteous life. So I'd like to think that that's the reason I have gray hair. The point, however, I think is really the fact that if you reach elderly age, you didn't do it by accident. And I think that's the message now. I have a little fun with it because I tell them, oh, see, gray hair, it's in the Bible. I'm wise because I have gray hair. And it's a crown. But then I remember in 12 verse 4, it said a wife of noble character is a husband's crown. So is it April's fault that I have gray hair? No, that can't be it. That can't be right. No, it's the verse 32 in that same chapter 16. It says, better a patient man than a warrior, a man who controls his temper than one who takes a city. Again, I have to point back to the example, the ultimate example we have of Christ. He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have taken his right position as king of the world, right? But his rightful position is king of the world in heaven, right? And we need to make sure that we remember to keep him there every day. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk next week.
What's the hardest thing to do? Somebody wants